The ice screamed before it broke. For 6 days, the drilling rigs of the Threshold Concord had chewed through the frozen crust of the rogue moon, and for 6 days the moon had given nothing back but silence. Then, on the 7th, the silence ended. Vesic Thane felt it before she heard it, a vibration that moved up through the soles of her boots, through the floor of the excavation shelter, into her teeth. She set down her data slate and looked at the seismic readout. The line that had been flat for 6 days was no longer flat. "Tell me that's the drill," she said. The technician beside her, a narrow-shouldered Concord engineer named Tor, shook his head slowly, eyes fixed on the screen. "The drill's offline, powered down for the night cycle. This is coming from below." Vesic had spent 11 years of her life chasing rumors, fragments of pre-Concord inscriptions found on 3 different worlds, all describing the same thing in 3 different dead languages: a doorway, a threshold, a gate that did not lead to a place but to a between. Her colleagues called it myth. Her funding committee called it a waste of resources. She had spent her savings and her reputation dragging a research vessel to the edge of known space to stand on a moon nobody had bothered to name because she believed the myth was real. Now the ice was answering her. "Get the ship on comms," she said. "Tell them we need full survey teams down here within the hour." By the time the sun, a small, distant thing barely worth the name, rose over the excavation site, the source of the vibration was no longer a mystery. It was impossible to call it anything else. Buried under 400 meters of ice, glowing faintly blue through cracks that had not existed the day before, sat a ring. It was enormous. The survey drones that flew its circumference took 11 minutes to complete a single pass. Its surface was seamless, unmarked by tool or weld, built from a material the scanners refused to identify. It was not corroded. It was not damaged. After what the Geological Survey estimated to be tens of thousands of years buried in ice, it looked new. Vesic stood at the edge of the excavation pit and stared down at it, and for the first time in her adult life, she found she had nothing to say. Director Thane. The voice belonged to Commander Eeth Sol, the mission's ranking officer, a broad-shouldered Concord veteran who had commanded 3 border patrols and did not like surprises. He did not sound pleased. "This wasn't in the mission parameters. We came here to survey ruins, not to wake something up." "We didn't wake it up," Vesic said. "It woke itself up. That reading, the vibration, it started before we broke through. It knew we were coming." "That's not possible." Neither was finding a fully intact structure under 400 meters of ice that shouldn't have a single working component left in it, Vesic said. And yet, Sol didn't answer that. He didn't need to. He was already looking at the ring the way soldiers looked at things they didn't understand, with suspicion and with the quiet calculation of a man deciding how fast he could get his people off this moon, if it came to that. It took another 2 days to clear enough ice to expose the ring's inner face, and what they found there silenced the entire excavation crew. Not carved, grown into the material itself, was a language. Not the fragmented pictographs Vesic had spent her career deciphering. A full, complete language, dense with meaning her translation algorithms choked on within seconds. But one symbol repeated itself over and over across the ring's surface, larger than the rest. Unmistakable even without translation. A door. "It's a gateway," Vesic said quietly, running her scanner over the largest symbol for the 4th time. "Everything I've ever found at every fragment, every ruin, it was pointing at this. This is real. This is the thing they were all afraid of." "Afraid of?" Sol repeated. "You didn't mention afraid of in your proposal. I didn't know for certain until now." She looked up at him. "The oldest texts I've translated don't describe this as a discovery. They describe it as a warning. Do not wake what waits beyond the threshold. I always assumed that was superstition. Poetic language for something the ancients didn't understand. And now?" Vesic didn't answer right away. She looked back down at the ring, at the door symbol repeated 100 times across its surface like a chant, like something that needed saying more than once to be believed. "Now I think they meant it literally." The Concord High Command back home took 4 days to respond to the survey reports, and their answer, when it came, was exactly what Vesic had feared. Proceed with extreme caution, document everything, activate nothing without full authorization. Which meant, in practice, months of bureaucratic delay while a discovery unlike anything in recorded history sat glowing quietly under the ice, waiting. Vesic didn't have months. She didn't entirely understand why, only that something in her, some instinct sharpened by over a decade of chasing this exact moment, told her that waiting was the wrong choice. The structure wasn't inert. It was awake, and it had been awake since the moment their drill broke through to it. And every day they spent filing reports back to a bureaucracy 4 systems away was a day this thing sat there, doing whatever it was doing, unobserved. She found Sewell alone that night, staring at the ring through the observation deck's reinforced glass, the blue light of the structure painting shifting patterns across his face. "I want to activate the outer ring," she said. "A partial power sequence, not a full activation, just enough to read what it does when it responds to input." Command said no. "Command is 4 systems away and doesn't know what we're looking at." Sewell turned to face her, and for a moment she thought he was going to refuse outright, call it insubordination, have her confined to quarters until the authorization came through properly. Instead, he looked back out at the glowing ring, and something in his expression, not fear exactly, but its cousin, the wariness of a man who had survived things by trusting his instincts, flickered across his face. "You really think this is what your ruins were warning about?" "I think," Vesic said carefully, "that whoever built this locked the door on purpose and buried it, and then spent thousands of years making sure nobody forgot why. That's not the behavior of a species protecting a treasure, Commander. That's the behavior of a species protecting everyone else from a mistake they already made once." Sewell was quiet for a long moment. "Partial sequence only," he said finally. "Outer ring, minimum power, full abort protocol on standby. If anything reads as active on the far side, we shut it down and wait for Command's answer like we should have from the start." It should have been enough of a safeguard. It should have given them time to stop, to think, to reconsider. It wasn't, and it didn't. Because the moment the outer ring received its first trickle of power, every sensor in the excavation shelter screamed at once. "Commander." Tor's voice cracked with something close to panic as he stared at his readouts, hands frozen over the console. The power signature isn't coming from our sequence. Something on the other side is already drawing energy. Something's already active." Vesic felt the floor of her certainty drop away entirely. "That's not possible," Sewell said, echoing her own words back at her from 2 days before, and this time there was no confidence in it at all. "Nothing's been active in there for thousands of years." "It's not asking permission," Tor said, and his voice had gone very quiet, very fast. "It's responding. Something on the other side felt us open the door, and it's answering back." The ring's blue light surged, brighter than anything they had recorded, and the air in the excavation pit began to bend and shimmer as the space within the ring stopped being empty. Saul was already shouting the order to abort, hands slamming toward the emergency cutoff, but it was too late for that now. Too late for caution. Too late for anything but watching. The gateway was opening whether they wanted it to or not. And on the other side, in the darkness beyond the threshold, something was already waiting for them to arrive. Light did not pour through the gateway. It arrived all at once like a held breath finally released, and then the world on the other side of the ring simply existed, as if it had always been there, and the ice and the moon and the excavation pit had been the illusion instead. Vesic gripped the observation rail and stared through the reinforced glass at a space that should not have fit behind a ring 400 meters wide. It was vast, impossibly vast. What lay beyond the threshold was not a chamber or a tunnel, but something closer to the inside of a hollowed-out world, a structure so large that its far walls vanished into a haze of distance and pale light. Towers of dark, seamless material rose out of a floor she couldn't see the edges of. Bridges of light connected them in patterns that made no structural sense and needed none, because whatever held them up wasn't gravity as she understood it. "Sensors," Sewell barked. and his voice had lost every trace of its earlier calm. I want atmosphere, radiation, structural integrity, all of it now. Atmosphere's breathable, Tor said, staring at his readout like it had personally betrayed him. Breathable, Commander. Standard composition, standard pressure. It's not just survivable, it's comfortable. Like it was built for something that breathes exactly what we breathe. Nobody said anything to that for a long moment. Power source? Sewell asked. Active. Extremely active. I'm reading systems on the other side of that threshold that have clearly been running the entire time we thought this place was dead. Some of it might have been running since before our civilization started keeping calendars. That's not possible, Sewell said, for what felt like the third time in 2 days. And Vesic was beginning to suspect he was going to keep saying it until reality stopped disagreeing with him. Commander. A new voice tight with alarm from the sensor station near the back of the shelter. I'm reading a transmission. Directed. It's coming through the gateway, and it's addressed to us. The shelter went silent. Put it through, Sewell said after a pause that stretched too long. The voice that came through the speakers a moment later was not what any of them expected. It was calm, unhurried, and it spoke in flawless, unaccented Concord standard, a language that existed nowhere within the borders of the gateway's ancient burial, a language that, by every measure of history Vesic knew, should not have been spoken by anything on the other side of that threshold. Threshold Concord vessel, the voice said. Your gateway activation has been received. You are welcome to cross. No hostile action will be taken against your personnel. Please proceed at your own pace. Sewell's jaw worked silently for a moment before he found words. Identify yourself. State your species and your authority over this structure. There was the faintest pause, almost thoughtful, before the voice answered. My name is Elias Reyes. I'll answer the rest of your questions in person, Commander, if you're willing to come through. It's easier to trust a face than a voice through a wall none of us built. Vesic felt something cold settle in her stomach. None of us built. Not I didn't build. None of us. Vesic, Sewell said quietly, not looking away from the shimmering doorway. Tell me your instincts on this. She thought about the warning carved into the ring 100 times over. She thought about a species that had buried a door and then spent millennia making sure no one forgot not to open it. She thought about the impossible fact of a voice on the other side speaking her language before she had ever spoken to it. My instincts say we're standing at the edge of something that's going to change everything we think we know, she said, and I don't think we get to leave without finding out what. They crossed in a party of 6, Sewell, Vesic, Tor, and 3 armed Concord security personnel, weapons drawn but lowered, every sensor they carried recording everything. The threshold itself felt like nothing. No resistance, no sensation of movement, just one step in the ice-cold excavation shelter, and the next step onto a floor that felt warm underfoot, in air that smelled faintly, impossibly, of rain. The scale of the place was worse up close than it had looked through the glass. Vesic had to stop walking for a moment just to let her mind catch up with what her eyes were reporting. Towers that had no visible tops, light that came from no identifiable source, a horizon that curved upward instead of away, like standing inside the shell of an egg built by something with no respect for the ordinary rules of architecture. And there were no ruins here. No dust. No decay. Everything gleamed with the particular, unmistakable cleanliness of a place that was still being cared for. Someone lives here, Vesic murmured. Someone's been living here the entire time. Welcome, said a voice behind them, and every weapon in the party snapped up at once. The man standing there had not been there a moment before, or if he had, none of them had seen him arrive. He was human in shape, 2 arms, 2 legs, a face that could have belonged to any number of species across a dozen worlds if Vesic hadn't already known better, having studied enough archived first contact records to recognize the particular structure of a human face when she saw one. He wore simple, dark clothing, unarmed as far as she could tell, and he looked at the 6 of them with an expression that unsettled her more than any weapon could have. He looked relieved. Commander Reyes, Sewell said carefully, weapon still raised. You'll forgive us for being cautious. Of course. Reyes didn't flinch at the weapon pointed at his chest. He didn't even seem to notice it. You have every reason to be. I imagine this is a great deal to take in all at once. His gaze moved past Sewell, past the soldiers, and settled on Vesic with an attention that felt oddly personal, oddly warm. You're the one who found us. The archaeologist. Vesic Thane, she said, unsettled by how easily he'd identified her among the group. How do you know that? I don't. Not specifically, Reyes said, and something like amusement crossed his face. But there's always one. Someone who spends their whole life chasing a story everyone else calls a myth, right up until the day it turns out to be real. It's practically a rule. He inclined his head slightly, an old-fashioned gesture that felt strange coming from a man standing in the middle of an impossible structure. Welcome to the Black Nexus, Director Thane. You've been looking for this place for a long time. I hope it's everything you hoped. What is this place? Vesic asked, unable to keep the question in any longer. What are you? How do you speak our language? How is any of this? She gestured helplessly at the towers, the light, the impossible curved horizon. How is any of this here? Reyes's expression shifted just slightly into something more careful, something that looked, for the first time, like a man choosing his next words with real weight behind them. Those are good questions, he said, and I promise you all of them have answers. But some of them are going to take longer to explain than others, and some of them. He paused, glancing briefly toward Sewell, toward the weapons still raised, toward the 6 visitors standing in the doorway of a structure older than either of their civilizations understood. Some of them you're not going to like. Try us, Sewell said. Reyes studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly, as if that answer had told him something important about the kind of man he was dealing with. All right, he said. Let's start with something easier then. Something you'll want to see for yourselves before we get to the harder questions. He turned, gesturing for them to follow, moving with the unhurried confidence of a man walking through a home he had lived in his entire life. You're not the first Concord expedition to find this gateway, Director Thane. You're just the first one to make it back out. Vesic's stomach dropped. There's another Concord ship's crew here, Reyes said, still walking, not looking back to see the effect his words had. Been here a long time. We've taken good care of them. He glanced over his shoulder then, and whatever warmth had been in his expression before was tempered now with something heavier, something like old grief carefully managed. Would you like to meet them? The old woman's hands were shaking before she even saw their faces clearly. Vesic watched her from across the wide, sunlit chamber Reyes had led them to. A room unlike anything else they'd seen in the Black Nexus so far, built low and warm and lived in, with furniture that looked handmade rather than grown from the structure's strange, seamless material. There were books, actual physical books, stacked on shelves built from something that looked almost like wood. There were drawings pinned to the walls made by hands that had clearly practiced for years to get them right. There were people, old people, conquered people, standing and staring at the 6 new arrivals with an expression Vesic had no name for, because she had never seen anyone look at anything quite like that before. Somewhere between disbelief and hunger and terror that if they blinked, it would all disappear. Dral, Sewell said, staring at the elderly conquered woman nearest to them, and something in his voice had gone very quiet. Dralianvash, you were listed as lost. 31 years ago. The Halcyon Reach, your whole crew was listed as lost. The old woman, Dral, let out a sound that was half a laugh and half something breaking loose after being held too tightly for too long. 31 years, she repeated. Is that all it's been? Feels longer, feels like forever. Some days and other days it feels like I only just stepped through that door. She looked past Sewell to Vesic, to Pator, taking in their uniforms, the insignia, small details that told her more about the passage of time than any calendar could. You're flying the newer hull configuration. They redesigned the sensor array. That happened, what, 20 years ago? 22? 23. Tor said faintly. Dral nodded slowly, as if confirming something she'd already suspected but hadn't wanted to be certain of. The Halcyon Reach found this gateway on a survey run, she said, sitting down heavily in a chair that looked like it had been built specifically for her at some point by someone who cared whether she was comfortable. Same as you. Curiosity got the better of good sense, same as you. We came through, and the gateway on the far side, the one that should have taken us home again, it wasn't stable. Something about the activation sequence went wrong. It collapsed behind us before we understood what was happening. You were trapped, Vesic said quietly. We were stranded, Draal corrected gently, which is a different thing, and I want you to understand the difference because it matters. She looked toward Reyes, who stood near the doorway, arms folded, watching this reunion with the careful stillness of a man who had seen this exact scene play out before and knew better than to intrude on it. They didn't imprison us. They didn't experiment on us, didn't interrogate us, didn't treat us as anything but guests who'd arrived somewhere by terrible accident. They gave us this. She gestured at the room, the books, the drawings on the walls, and they gave us the truth, as much of it as we could handle at a time, and they gave us their word that if the gateway could ever be stabilized again, they'd send us home. 31 years, Sewell said again, and this time his voice carried something rawer. You've been here 31 years, and Concord Command wrote your whole crew off as dead in the first year. Most of my crew is dead, Draal said, and for the first time her composure slipped just slightly. Old age. Illness. 2 accidents in the early years before we understood how the structure worked. There were 41 of us on the Halcyon Reach. There are 9 of us left. She held Saul's gaze. And every single one of us is alive today, because of the people in this place. Not despite them, Commander. Because of them. Vesic felt something twist in her chest, grief and awe and a deep, uncomfortable shame all tangled together. Her civilization had lost this crew and simply moved on, filed them under acceptable losses, closed the record. And this whole time they had been here, cared for, taught, kept safe, by a species the Concord had never once heard mentioned in any record older than a handful of decades. Why didn't you send word? She asked Reyes. If you had the capability, if this structure has the power to open a gateway at all, why didn't you find some way to tell the Concord your people were alive? Reyes's jaw tightened, just slightly. Because the gateway that brought them here wasn't the only door in this structure, he said. And every door we open is a risk we don't take lightly. We couldn't send a message. We could only wait for the right kind of knock. His eyes moved to Vesic. Yours was the right kind. What does that mean? Sewell demanded. What kind of risk? You said no hostile action would be taken against us. Is there something in here that would be hostile? Reyes didn't answer right away. And in the silence that followed, Vesic noticed something she hadn't let herself focus on before. The tension underneath his calm. The way his eyes kept flicking, almost unconsciously, toward the far wall of the chamber, toward the vast structure outside it, as if some part of him was always listening for something the rest of them couldn't hear. There are things in this galaxy older than either of our peoples, Reyes said finally, choosing each word like it cost him something. Things that were sealed away a very long time ago, for very good reasons. This structure, the Black Nexus, isn't just a gateway. It's part of the system that keeps them sealed. Every activation, every crossing, sends out a signal. Most of the time, that signal fades before it reaches anything that matters. He paused. This time, it didn't fade fast enough. The room went cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. Explain, Sewell said. Before Reyes could answer, the chamber lights flickered, once, sharply, and then steadied, and a low tone began sounding somewhere deep within the structure, a sound that Vesic felt in her bones before she consciously registered hearing it. Draal's face went pale. The other elderly survivors in the room, the ones who had lived here for decades, who knew this place better than any newcomer possibly could, were already moving, already reaching for things, already afraid in a way that told Vesic more clearly than any explanation could that this was not a drill. Elias. Draal's voice was tight, urgent, all the warmth of a moment ago gone. That's the outer perimeter alarm. That's not a maintenance cycle. Reyes closed his eyes for half a second. Just half a second. Just long enough for Vesic to see something pass across his face that looked almost like exhaustion. Like a man bracing for a weight he had carried many times before, and had hoped, foolishly, not to carry again so soon. No, he agreed quietly. It's not. He opened his eyes, and whatever calm, welcoming warmth had defined him since the moment they'd met him was gone, replaced by something harder, faster, entirely focused. They felt the gateway open, he said, already moving toward the door, already speaking into some kind of comm device at his wrist in short, clipped commands Vesic couldn't fully follow. It's been years since the last activation, years since anything gave them a reason to look this way. And now, he stopped in the doorway just long enough to look back at the 6 stunned, conquered visitors standing in the middle of a room full of people who had spent decades learning exactly how frightening this moment could be. Now they've noticed we opened again, he said. Get your people back to your ship, now. This is about to get very bad, very fast. Behind him, through the wide chamber window that looked out over the impossible vastness of the Black Nexus, Vesic saw it happening. Towers along the distant, curved horizon beginning to shift, panels sliding open like eyes coming awake after a very long sleep, revealing structures beneath that were unmistakably weapons. Weapons on a scale she had no framework to properly measure, powering up one by one across a horizon that seemed to stretch on forever. Something enormous and old and clearly not human was waking up to answer the noise the gateway had made. And it did not sound welcoming at all. The first impact hit the outer hull hard enough that Vesic felt it through the floor before the sound even reached her. A deep, structure-shaking thud that traveled up through her boots and rattled the books off the shelves in the room they'd stood in only minutes before. Move. Reyes's voice cut through the chamber, no longer the calm, welcoming tone of a host, but something sharper, honed by years of practice into pure, immediate authority. All of you with me now. They ran. Vesic had never run through a structure like this before. Corridors that bent in ways that shouldn't have been navigable at speed. Floors that seemed to shift their footing slightly to keep people upright as they sprinted. Walls that pulsed with warning light in patterns she didn't understand but instinctively read as urgent. Around them, more figures emerged from side passages. More humans dressed not in the simple clothing Reyes had worn but in dark, functional armor, moving with the practiced efficiency of soldiers who had done this exact thing more times than any of them wanted to count. Sergeant. Reyes caught the arm of a young woman jogging past, armored, a rifle slung across her back that looked engineered rather than manufactured, all sharp economical lines. Get the conquered party to the gateway threshold, full escort. On it. On. The woman, dark-haired, sharp-eyed, with a scar along her jaw that spoke of some earlier engagement Vesic didn't want to ask about right now, turned to the group with brisk assessment. Stay close, stay low when I say low, and don't touch anything that's glowing red. I'm Sergeant Mara Voss, let's move. Voss, Sol repeated as they ran, glancing sideways at her. Any relation to the things trying to kill us? No. Mara didn't slow down. Get that question out of your system now, because I've been answering it my whole life and I really don't have time for it today. The corridor opened suddenly onto a wide, elevated causeway, and for the first time Vesic saw the enemy directly. Vast shapes moving against the distant curve of the Black Nexus's horizon, mechanical and organic in ways that refused to resolve cleanly into either category, moving with a coordinated hive-like precision that made her skin crawl. Weapons fire lanced between the Nexus's own defense towers and the approaching shapes, brilliant arcs of light that turned the artificial sky the color of an open wound. What are those? Vesic shouted over the noise. Later, Mara snapped, pulling her down behind a raised barrier as something screamed overhead, close enough that the heat of it washed across the back of Vesic's neck. Right now you need to run, not ask questions. They kept moving. Vesic lost track of how long, minutes stretching and compressing under the adrenaline, every corridor bringing new sights she didn't have time to process. human soldiers holding choke points with a calm, methodical discipline that unsettled her more than panic would have. A woman younger than Mara directing triage in a side chamber full of wounded, hands steady despite the chaos around her. An old man, older even than Drawl, standing at a command console, giving orders in a voice that never once rose above a controlled, level pitch even as the readouts in front of him showed defenses failing in real time. This was not a people caught by surprise. This was a people who had drilled for this exact nightmare so many times that even the worst of it moved like memorized choreography. "They've done this before," Vesic said, as much to herself as to anyone. "Ancestors, generations. This isn't the first time. It's not even close to the first time," Mara said grimly, checking a corner before waving them forward. "Ask my grandmother sometime, assuming we all live long enough for introductions." The causeway ahead of them buckled, not from enemy fire, but from something worse, some deep structural failure rippling through the Nexus itself, panels of the false sky above cracking and dimming in a spreading pattern that made Vesic's stomach drop with a different, colder kind of fear. "Voss." Reyes's voice came through Mara's comm, tight and urgent. "Defense grids failing on the eastern quadrant. We're losing containment faster than the automated systems can compensate." "How much time?" "Not enough." A pause, heavy with implication. "I'm heading for the anchor point." Mara's expression changed instantly, the controlled calm cracking for just a fraction of a second into something rawer, more afraid, before she smoothed it back into discipline. "Copy that," she said, voice tight. "En route." "What's the anchor point?" Vesic asked, catching the shift in her even through the noise and chaos. Mara didn't answer immediately, and when she did, her voice had gone carefully flat in the way people's voices go flat when they are trying very hard not to feel something in front of strangers. "It's a failsafe. Old system. Older than most of what's active in this place. When the automated defense grid can't hold, someone has to anchor it manually, channel a stabilizing signal through a live connection instead of the failing machinery." She kept moving, kept scanning corners, kept doing her job with a professionalism that Vesic now understood was costing her everything to maintain. "It's not gentle on the person doing it." "How not gentle?" Mara didn't answer that one at all. They reached a wide, open chamber at the heart of the structure, a space unlike anything else they had passed through, ringed with towering conduits of pulsing light that converged on a single raised platform at its center, humming with a barely restrained power that made the hair on Vesic's arm stand up even from a distance. Reyes was already there, standing at the base of the platform, stripped of the calm host persona entirely now, every line of him focused and grim. "Dad." The word came out of Mara before she seemed to fully decide to say it, raw and young in a way that cut through every layer of soldier discipline she'd been carrying since the alarm sounded. "Don't. Let someone else take the anchor. You did this 3 years ago, you know what it costs." "There isn't time to argue about who's most rested," Reyes said, not unkindly, but with the immovable calm of a decision already made. "The eastern grid fails in under 2 minutes. I'm the fastest option and you know it. Elias." Vesic stepped forward before she'd fully thought through why, driven by something she didn't have a name for yet, some instinct that refused to simply watch this happen without at least trying. "There has to be another way. We have conquered technology, power regulation systems, medical. There isn't time to explain how any of that would work even if it could help," Reyes said, and for just a moment looking at her, something in his expression softened, grateful and sad at once. "But thank you for offering. That matters more than you know." He turned to the platform, to the conduits humming with light around it, and Mara's voice cracked as she said his name a second time. Not Commander, not Elias, just Dad, small and afraid and furious all at once, the voice of a daughter watching her father walk toward something that had already cost him pieces of himself before. Reyes paused just long enough to look back at her, and whatever he said next was lost beneath the sound of the chamber's alarms rising to a new, urgent pitch. The eastern grid's failure accelerating faster than anyone had accounted for, the platform's light surging in warning, and every readout in the chamber screaming the same message at once. 30 seconds. Reyes stepped onto the platform, and the light consumed him. The scream that tore out of Mara Voss was not the sound of a soldier. It was the sound of a daughter, and for one terrible second, Vesic thought they had lost him entirely. That the light devouring the platform had simply erased Elias Reyes from existence in front of all of them. Then the light steadied, and within it, barely visible, a human shape remained standing, spine rigid, arms outstretched along the conduits, as though he had been grown into the structure itself. The alarms in the chamber shifted pitch, not silencing, but changing, the frantic countdown replaced by something slower, something that sounded almost like relief. "Grid stabilizing," came a voice over Mara's comm, tight with disbelief. "Eastern quadrant holding, he's got it. He's actually got it." Mara didn't move. She stood frozen at the base of the platform, staring up at her father suspended in that column of light. And Vesic understood, watching her, that "got it" and "safe" were not the same word here. Whatever was happening to Reyes inside that light was not free. "How long does he have to hold it?" Vesic asked quietly. "However long it takes for the automated grid to recover enough to take the load back," Mara said, not looking away from the platform. Her voice had gone very steady, very controlled. The sound of someone holding themselves together through sheer discipline. Could be minutes. Could be longer. And if it's longer... Mara's jaw tightened. She didn't answer. Vesic turned to the conduits, to the systems humming around the platform, and something in her, the same instinct that had spent 11 years chasing a myth nobody else believed in, refused to simply stand and watch. She pulled her scanner from her belt, running it over the nearest conduit, her mind already racing through the readings. "This is a raw energy transfer system," she said, half to herself. "Unregulated. It's channeling directly through him instead of through a buffer." She looked up sharply. "Do you have anything that could act as a load-bearing intermediary? Something to take even a fraction of that current off him?" Mara looked at her properly for the first time since they'd entered the chamber, something shifting in her expression. Surprise, and underneath it, a flicker of desperate hope she was clearly trying not to feel too strongly. "We don't have anything like that. Never needed it. Nobody outside the Nexus has ever offered to help before. Conquered field medical units carry portable energy dampeners," Vesic said, already moving, already calling up the specs on her slate. "They're designed for reactor containment breaches, not this, but the principle should transfer, reducing peak load, distributing it across a buffer instead of a single point." She looked at Saul. "Our ship, now." It took 11 minutes to retrieve the equipment and adapt it. 11 minutes during which Mara never once looked away from the platform, never once let the fear on her face fully show. And when the dampener finally hummed to life beside the conduits, redirecting a fraction of the brutal current away from the light-wreathed figure at the platform's center, Vesic watched something in Reyes's rigid posture ease, just slightly. Not comfort, but less than before. "That's..." The voice on the comm was disbelieving. "That's actually working. Load on the primary anchor point just dropped 9%. Mara let out a breath that shook audibly, and for just a moment, standing beside Vesic in the humming light of the chamber, the careful soldier's composure cracked enough to let something younger and rawer through. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Nobody's ever, in 30 years, nobody's ever offered to help carry this. Not like that." "You've been doing this alone that long?" Vesic asked. Mara's laugh was short and humorless. "Longer. This structure's been standing between the galaxy and something that would tear it apart for a lot longer than 30 years, Director. My grandmother did this same thing, on this same platform, when she was younger than I am now. Her mother did it before her." She looked up at the light, at her father held inside it, and something old and tired moved behind her eyes. "We don't really talk about how long. It stopped feeling important a long time ago. You just do the job. And you teach your kids to do the job, and you hope the ones after you get to stop needing to. The eastern grid held. Slowly, over the following hour, the alarms across the chamber began, one by one, to quiet, and the distant impacts against the Nexus's outer hull grew less frequent, less violent, until finally, they stopped altogether. The light around the platform dimmed, and Reyes sagged forward, caught before he could fall by two soldiers who moved as though they had caught him this exact way before. He was alive, exhausted, drained in a way that looked bone-deep but alive, and Mara was at his side in an instant, one hand gripping his shoulder like she needed the physical proof of it. "Told you," Reyes managed, voice hoarse, a ghost of his earlier calm returning even through obvious pain. "Fastest option." "You're an idiot," Mara said, and there were tears on her face that she didn't bother hiding anymore. "You're a stubborn old idiot, and I hate you, and don't ever do that again." "No promises," Reyes said. And something in the exchange, the exhaustion, the love wrapped in exasperation, the sheer familiar routine of it, told Vesic this was not the first time this exact conversation had happened either. While the medical team worked on stabilizing him, Vesic found herself pulled toward the deeper archive chambers of the Nexus almost without deciding to go, driven by the same restless need to understand that had brought her to this gateway in the first place. Dral had mentioned records, decades of accumulated history, human and otherwise, stored somewhere within the structure's oldest sections. If there was an answer to what this place truly was, to why humanity had been here holding this line for generations no one outside had known about, it would be there. She found it 3 hours later, in a chamber lit by the same soft, ever-present glow as the rest of the Nexus, standing in front of an archive display that had taken her the better part of that time to properly translate. And when the translation finally resolved into something coherent, she had to read it 4 times before she let herself believe it. The architecture, the language embedded in the archive's oldest layers, the construction techniques described in fragments too degraded for full translation, but unmistakable in their underlying grammar. She had seen this exact structural language before, on 3 different worlds, in 3 different sets of ruins her own people had spent centuries failing to properly understand. Ruins the conquered had always assumed belonged to some vanished precursor species, gone so long before recorded history that even their name had been lost. Her hands were shaking by the time she made her way back to the medical bay, where Reyes sat propped up in a low bed, pale but alert, Mara seated close beside him, refusing to leave his side even now that the danger had passed. "Elias," Vesic said, and something in her voice made both of them look up sharply. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth, however hard it is." Reyes studied her face for a long moment, and whatever he saw there seemed to tell him exactly what question was coming, because something like resignation and something like relief moved across his exhausted features at once. "Ask," he said quietly. "Your people didn't just inherit this place," Vesic said, forcing the words out steady even though her pulse was racing. "You didn't just find it, the way I found the gateway on Kepler-9's moon. The architecture in those deep archives. I've seen fragments of that same language before on ruins my own people have never been able to explain. Your species didn't just come to guard the Black Nexus." She stopped, needing to hear herself say it before she could believe it. "You helped build it, didn't you? Before the conquered existed. Before almost anyone existed. Your people were here at the very beginning." For a long moment, Reyes said nothing at all. Then slowly, tiredly, a faint smile crossed his face. Not surprise, not defensiveness, but something that looked almost like a held breath finally released. "Wondered when someone was finally going to ask that question properly," he said. "Sit down, Director Thane. This is going to take a while to explain, and I think after everything you've done for us today, you've more than earned the whole story." Reyes began with a question of his own. "How old do you think your civilization is, Director? Not your species. Your civilization, the one with cities, with written records, with a memory of itself that stretches back far enough to call history." "On record, roughly 9,000 years, Vesic said. "Give or take." "That's about average from what I've seen," Reyes said. Most of the species we've met over the centuries fall somewhere in that range. A few outliers, older or younger, but broadly, civilizations seem to rise on roughly similar timelines once a species gets there. He shifted against the pillows, wincing slightly, and Mara adjusted them without being asked. A small unconscious gesture of care neither of them seemed to notice they were performing. Humanity's written history goes back a little further than that. Not enormously further. A few extra 1,000 years, give or take, depending on which records survived which disasters. That's not the answer to what I asked, Vesic said gently. No, Reyes agreed. Because the honest answer isn't about how old our civilization is. It's about how old the people who built this structure were, and the truth is most of my species doesn't know that answer either. We forgot. Ice ages, floods, the slow grinding erosion of thousands of years. Most of what happened before written history got buried, right along with the people who lived it. What's left is fragments, myths that don't quite make sense. Stories about doors and thresholds and things that shouldn't be woken. He paused. Sound familiar? Vesic thought of her own 11 years chasing exactly those kinds of fragments, and said nothing, because it did. A very, very long time ago, Reyes continued, before most of the species currently in this galaxy had learned to leave their own worlds, there was a civilization, the ones who actually built the Nexus network, this structure and others like it scattered across the stars. We don't fully understand what they were anymore. Records that old don't survive cleanly, not even here. But we know they built something extraordinary, and we know they made an enemy while doing it, the Voss Harrow. He nodded toward the chamber's far wall, toward the direction of the battle that had nearly killed him hours before. Ancient, patient, and utterly without mercy toward anything that wasn't itself. The Nexus builders fought them for longer than either of our recorded histories put together, and in the end they couldn't destroy them, so they sealed them instead, locked away behind gateways like this one, scattered and buried, watched over so the doors would never quietly open again. And humanity helped, Vesic said quietly. That's what the archive was telling me. That's what I saw in the architecture. Humanity was there, Reyes said. I won't pretend we fully understand our own role in it anymore. That knowledge is one of the things time took from us, but the oldest fragments we have suggest that some of our ancestors worked alongside the Nexus builders, learned what they knew, and when the builders finally faded, whatever that means, we've never been sure, some of us stayed behind, chose to keep the doors sealed, passed that duty down, generation after generation, long after the reason for it had blurred into half-remembered story. He looked at Mara, at the exhaustion and quiet pride on her face. We've been standing at this wall for longer than either of us can properly measure, Director. We don't do it because we remember exactly why anymore. We do it because it's the only thing that's always been true about us. This is what we are. The chamber was quiet for a long moment. Somewhere beyond it, Vesic knew, Concord technicians were already documenting everything they'd seen, preparing reports that would shake the foundations of everything the wider galaxy believed about its own history. But in this room, right now, none of that mattered as much as the two people in front of her. A father who had nearly killed himself holding a line nobody outside this structure had ever known existed, and a daughter who had grown up learning to do the same. You could have told us, Vesic said. Once the gateway opened, you could have told the Concord immediately, asked for help, asked for relief. Why did you wait until we forced the questions out of you? Would you have believed us? Reyes asked, not unkindly. A handful of humans alone in an ancient structure claiming to have helped hold back a threat older than every spacefaring species you've ever catalogued? You'd have called it a myth. The same myth you spent 11 years being told not to chase. He smiled, faint and tired. We've learned over a long time that the truth lands better when someone's ready to see it for themselves. You were ready. That's rarer than you'd think. It took 3 more days for the Concord's full response fleet to arrive, cautious at first, then astonished. Then, as the reports filtered up through command and the weight of what had been found here settled in, something closer to reverent. Vesic stood on the same causeway where she'd first seen the Voss Harrow's shapes moving against the horizon, watching instead as Concord relief ships settled into position along the Nexus's outer defenses, technicians and soldiers disembarking to stand shoulder to shoulder with humans who had, until 3 days ago, held this line entirely alone. Mara found her there, no longer in combat armor. Her sergeant's composure looser now, easier, worn like someone finally allowed to set down a weight she hadn't realized had grown so heavy. "Strange, isn't it?" she said, watching the ships settle in. "This is the first time in my whole life I've seen anyone else's soldiers standing on this wall. My grandmother used to tell me stories about what it might look like, if the day ever came. I never really believed it would. Does it feel the way she described?" Vesic asked. Mara considered that for a long moment. "Better," she said finally. She always imagined it as relief. Mostly it just feels like... She searched for the word. Like being seen. Like something we did mattering to someone besides ourselves, finally. Reyes joined them a while later, still moving carefully, still recovering but upright, steady, watching the same view with an expression Vesic hadn't seen on him before. Something unguarded. Something that looked almost like peace. "Elias," Vesic said, "I have to ask. After everything, the sacrifice, the silence, the generations your people spent holding this without anyone else in the galaxy, even knowing you existed, what do you actually get out of finally being seen like this? What was it all for, if not this?" Reyes was quiet for a moment, watching the last of the relief ships settle into formation along the Nexus's ancient defenses, human and Concord crews already beginning, awkwardly but genuinely, to work side by side. "We didn't do it to be seen," he said finally, and there was no bitterness in it at all, only a kind of simple, hard-won certainty. "We did it so that someday, someone else would get the chance to be here, asking that question in the first place." He looked at Vesic, and something in his tired, steady gaze felt like a door finally, fully opening. "That's enough, Director. That was always going to be enough." Behind them, the Black Nexus hummed on, ancient and patient, no longer a secret held by a handful of exhausted guardians, but a shared burden, finally, carried by more shoulders than one small, stubborn species standing alone at the edge of the dark. And for the first time in longer than any of them could properly measure, the wall did not feel quite so heavy.